We're starting very punctually tonight because we have an opening coming up. So it's a really great pleasure to welcome and introduce Tishan Hsu this evening. Tishan Hsu is a contemporary visionary. With the most innovative techniques, his paintings and sculptures explore and manifest poetic ways to merge the concept of technology with nature and the human species. Born in Boston, he studied environmental architecture and film at MIT and Harvard University before moving to New York in the early 80s. Hsu's art has been showcased in many prominent exhibitions, and I'm not going to enumerate them here, worldwide. His work is represented by Miguel Abreu in New York, an empty gallery in Hong Kong. We are very excited that our exhibition will be traveling to the Contemporary Art Museum in Geneva, where the largest European retrospective to date will open in March. We welcome Geneva here tonight. I also want to welcome Patrizia Dander as conversation partner. She's head of the curatorial department at Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen, Düsseldorf. Until last year, she was leading curator at Museum Brandhorst in Munich. There she was most recently responsible for the exhibition Future Bodies from a Recent Past, a group exhibition with 60 artists, among them prominently featuring Tishan Hsu, and I guess that's where you got to know each other a little bit. The exhibition thematized the influence of technological developments and changing body discourses on sculpture. We cordially invite you all to attend the opening of our 3 exhibitions at 7 p.m. to be able to use all our time really for this conversation. I hope you understand that there will be no Q&A, but both Tishan and Patrizia will be present in the course of the evening to answer any questions you have. Thank you, Tishan. Thank you, Patrizia. We look forward to your exchange.
Thank you. There we go. We start with glitches. I guess that's a good entry point to the talk. Dear Sylvie Liska, dear Bettina Spör, dear Tishan, dear guests, it's really a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Tishan. As Sylvie Liska rightly said, your work was very important to an exhibition I prepared and curated at Museum Brandhorst, my last project there. And I'm really excited to see and sit in a space with all new works of yours, which is interesting because over the last 4 to 5 years, your practice and your oeuvre, which starts already in the 1980s, has really received a big reappraisal and really critical revision of what you've been doing since the 1980s. And whilst the previous exhibitions were more retrospective works that unearthed works from the 80s and 90s that had hardly been on view, this show kind of is full circle with the big institutional show, solo show with very contemporary works. And I think for everyone who came in, or at least that was my impression when I came in, was like, this looks so incredibly cool and it looks really very, very contemporary. But still, I want to go back as first step in our conversation, because I think even if we're immediately able to read a lot of the aesthetic questions, a lot of the imagery that pops up in your work now, this was not necessarily always the case when you worked. And a lot of the works that we see here relate back to 40 years of thinking and producing and really tackling the relationship between technology and the body, which is so seminal for your work. You studied in Boston, you studied architecture and environmental studies, and then in the late 70s, you moved to New York. Your work has been shown in different exhibitions, and still, when one looks back at those early shows, it didn't feel like your work had a huge context in terms of other artists that would have been sharing a similar practice or a similar engagement with those questions. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, when you came to New York and when you started working and exhibiting there in the 1980s, what was the context? Were there artists that you felt related to, or what was the context for your practice at the time?
Well, I'd say this is, there was a reaction going on in New York by the artists in my peer group that modernism had sort of run its course, and that there was a sense of cynicism and I should say it's the beginning of what we might call sort of postmodernism, and how to now play with the idea of originality and to go in the past and go into the future. I mean, that there's no sense of linear historical time. And to those of you who are aware of, the postmodern critique, that was beginning to emerge in a big way in contemporary art. And I could somewhat identify with certain aspects of that sensibility, and then others I really couldn't. And I think one of the driving factors is I did not go to art school. So this was a lot of the discourse that came out of the art schools at the time, particularly Cal Arts. And I came from an architectural background in Cambridge, Mass, at MIT, and there was a lot, it was not about the past. MIT, if nothing else, is about the future. And it was very dissonant for me to see that people weren't interested in that, and it seemed naive to be looking towards the future, because that was the paradigm of modernism as a whole, that we move into the future, we're progressing, we're improving, and their feeling was, well, look where we got. And therefore, there was a certain cynicism, and that the whole idea of originality is not relevant anymore, so to speak. And so I felt somewhat isolated in a way. I mean, I made friends and people were, very cordial and friendly, but in terms of my inner discourse, I definitely felt there was not a really good fit.
Yeah. That sounds pretty logical. I mean, I first saw your work in 2018, I think, or 19, at the Bard College. There was an exhibition and that looked at the legacy of two important New York gallerists, Colin Deland and Pat Hearn. And you worked with Pat Hearn since the mid-1980s, and the show featured artworks by painters like Jutta Köter, René Green, Andrea Fraser. These were the people that were exhibited in the context, and your work really felt like a singularity in that space. The only other artist that you might, in retrospect, feel related to is the work by Julia Scher that was very much into surveillance technologies, etc., some of which we also might recognize in your contemporary work. But who were then the people that you were discussing your work with? If you didn't find that in contemporary art, was that something where you still had a conversation with architecture or design, or was it something that just put you in a pretty isolated place altogether?
I mean, it was difficult. I was looking for compatibilities and intellectual support in a way to validate the way I was seeing things. I certainly think what I had experienced in Cambridge was a huge a validation for what I was seeing. I could see that what they were thinking about and what was being created was a very convincing case for what was going to be happening. I remember where the architectural studios were. They were more like a California beach house. And this is what the sort of the 60s, sort of counterculture, was the zeitgeist. And then I would go through Double Doors, and then there was Nicholas Negroponte, who wrote Being Digital at the time, was creating the first 3D model where you could go through a city on your computer screen.
When was that? Was that 75 or
This would have been about,
73?
73, 75.
Right.
And it was so stark because the architectural studios were just chaotic. People would sleep there, live there, cook there, everything. And then you'd walk through just the Double Doors, and it's all white, like this room. And the computer he was building from scratch was the size of the room itself. So for me, there was this clash. But I could see that what he was doing was just amazing to me. And I just somehow was drawn to it. So in terms of the contemporary art, I was very connected to the issues of minimalism, post-minimalism. Certainly, Carl Andre or Bruce Nauman. I mean, I could really see potential in what they were doing.
In terms of like seriality, the structures, production.
Exactly,
Yeah.
the syntax of that body of work. And in terms of my context, my peer groups were going towards neo-expressionism and reconstituting familiar styles in art history. So it was fine, but I mean, I just kind of, how should I say it? It was just so compelling for me what I was seeing from that that's what I wanted to do. I had to think of what's going to get me up in the morning, and whether I was an artist or not, this question was there very much. I would look out just in terms of what's going on in the world. I remember reading a quote by Walter Wriston, who was the CEO of Citibank, and he said, all distinctions are going to become blurred. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. So a banker, that's kind of what I was seeing as an artist. I mean, he's a banker. No one wants to talk about bankers. But I thought, that's interesting that he has a kind of vision, just like an artist would.
Yeah.
So for me, that was like, oh, so I'm not alone. He's seeing a similar kind of aspect of what's happening here. So it was things like that I kind of looked for. And then to support myself, I did word processing in a law firm in Wall Street. And so that experience of working in front of a word processing was the kind of first monitor, and the interactivity of it versus the passivity of TV was pivotal.
Yeah.
So there was sort of very real things just in my life that was really supporting what I was trying to do, more than the art world itself.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to keep in mind how seminal the inventions or technological changes of the late 60s and early 70s were. I mean, the internet was basically an invention of the late 60s with the ARPANET and first video games, the first PC, personal computer, that all dated back to this time. And these are things that came to fruition, came to wide dissemination only so much later. And I think that's so interesting with your work, that you pick up on developments very early on through the privileged access that you had with MIT, but then also your day job as word processors, and how specific aesthetics that were not widely disseminated at the time leaped into your work before they were even known or understood to a wider audience. And that's, I think, an interesting question about your work now, because at least when I see your work, your contemporary work, it relates to so many artists. But I just spoke with an artist in Düsseldorf, and they said, like, oh, it took me a long while to understand that Tishan Hsu has been working for such a long time already. It feels so contemporary. And I guess that's a reason, or let's say, I think there's a reason why your work has been unearthed and revisioned and discussed in those last year, because it resonates so strongly with contemporary discourses that we have on technology. And I'm wondering, if you feel related to a generation of younger artists that work with digital technologies that reflect on the relationship between technology and the body, or if for you it's a bit more like nothing new under the sun, we've seen this already and we understood it already in the 80s. What is your thinking about that, or how do you feel if you're shown with a much younger generation of artists in exhibitions?
Well, I'm thrilled that there's someone out there that's beginning to see the work. It is interesting. I in the last few years that a lot of my support has been from people who are under 40, and I remember the curator Sohrab Sohebi, who gave me the first sort of survey after so many years. When he was very enthusiastic about the work, I said, "You must be seeing something different than I am, because the reaction has been so sort of skeptical about the work for so long." And as a teacher, I'm aware that students are really different as they go through different generations. And so people who are much more familiar with this technological interface now, they must have a different sense of the reality. And I could say, well, maybe that is kind of what's happening here. So it's interesting that it's the same work from 1980 and that they're seeing something very different. So that says something about art in general and this strange phenomenon that the same objects we see, whether they're from the 1600s or from 2050, we see certain things that are relevant now and not relevant, but the object has stayed the same throughout time. And I think that's a very fascinating phenomena of just human consciousness and the relation of what we call art and the sort of contingency of human consciousness. So for me, it's like the first time in my life I've actually experienced that through my work. And it's a surprise to me as it is to anybody else. I had not seen my own work for maybe 20, 30 years. It was in storage, and it's very expensive to take it out of storage. And so the survey show was the first time I actually saw all the work together, and I was very, very surprised. And the work actually was much more coherent than how I felt all along, where I felt my practice was very dispersed and somewhat chaotic. And I never could get it together to really make a coherent kind of body of work like you see artists that are having their exhibitions. And so that's
it's interesting that you're saying that, because I would say there is such a clarity in the lineage over the last 40 years. I mean, even going back to very basic decisions, that your works come with these rounded corners. And I think in the beginning, a lot of your interest in these wall pieces was to present something on the wall which is not being read as a painting, but read as an object, and how to give it this object character by taking it away from the wall, giving it some depth, like physical materiality and depth. Whilst today we look at it obviously with our computer screens and Apple design and everything in mind, although even that goes back to the 1980s. I would totally agree with your works, and I would say that there is these technological paradigm shifts. They come in waves or in circles, no? And I guess we have been witnessing one of these great changing or turning points over the last 10 years, which has propelled so much work, which has propelled new technologies and new aesthetics. And I find it very plausible that now your work is being looked at again, because it relates to so many questions of screen, of surface, of skin, of technology, and of embodiment in a way. But I'm wondering, because there's a really beautiful quote that I read in an interview from you in 1990 with Richard Armstrong, where you said, "Part of the change I see happening is that the properties of media and information are becoming the properties of our existence, equal to those physical properties like weight or volume." And I think that's something that, at least I, for my part, really only came to understand over the last years during the COVID crisis, where we were basically all restrained to a very limited environment. We were bound to stay at home. Everything we did was mediated through the surface of screens, through digital technologies in a much stronger way than before. But I'm wondering, what made you understand or describe the situation that way at a time where we weren't at this point of dissemination, we weren't at this point where these technologies had become like everyday household items?
Yeah. Well, I think an important thing to mention here is that the way it felt doing all of this work was never the way I'm articulating it now. It was never so coherent or sort of logical or made sense. They were just very small, minute decisions along the way, driven by intuition. And I never imagined the iPhone, the iPad, the internet, the way it is, the way we interact, all of that was never there. I never imagined even the digital. I'm not a technologist, and even though I was at a place that was very technological, I was almost an observer. I was never a programmer, and I was kind of with awe, and they were still, somewhat separate. So I think to a certain extent, and I sort of believe in this, there's a certain unconscious aspect here to what has gone on, and this sort of piecemeal, I would do one thing and be a part of it, and then I wouldn't be happy with that, and I'd do something else, and do something else, and then redo it, and say, well, it has to go here, but then how am I going to do it? So this was all very, I had no sense of the big picture. Mm-hmm. I only had an intuition. And so I didn't have a language even to talk about it the way I am now. I could never talk about it at all, really. And people would say, what are you doing? And I said, well, it's just sort of vaguely something. And there was no discourse really around it. There was developments in music and literature that I could relate to on a sort of aesthetic or emotional, psychological level, but it was not articulated intellectually. Mm-hmm. So I often say there is no text to my work. It is meant that you react to it from a bodily sense. And although people are saying it's about technology, it's also about the body. And that was very fundamental from the very beginning, in that while we're going to have this technological transformation, the issues of the body are still going to be there. So I do not believe in a singularity where we're all going to be taken over by AI, which is sort of the hot topic right now. I thought it was very interesting during the pandemic, which was so unimagined, that on the one sense, people were using this technological interface of the web to profoundly connect when people were being disconnected. And at the same time, all of this was being caused by something so organic, like a virus. And that this virus had completely taken over and undermined this technological world we're living in. And that the two were happening simultaneously. And I thought that was like just amazing kind of paradox of the issue that I was trying to grasp with.
Yeah, but maybe it's not a paradox, because I think in a way the work that you did in the 1980s, it can be read through all these lenses of simulation theory, all these classical postmodern paradigms, but at the same time there had always been a feminist theory strand which had always insisted that technology is always embodied. And I'm wondering if that was the classical text, of course, Donna Haraway and the Cyborg Manifesto, which doesn't take apart the one from the other, whilst Baudrillard would say we all become just technology, the body becomes superfluous, we're going to dissolve in ether, or however you want to call it. A strong feminist legacy has always said no, or Elizabeth Grosz, she's basically said even in cyberspace that the glove that you wear is still the hand that's connected to your body, so you can't get rid of your body. Was that something that you were aware at the time?
Which part?
Like this feminist thinking around the relation between technology and the body?
I wasn't aware of it in the way you're articulating. I was very aware of Donna Haraway's work. I was very aware of feminist discourse going on in contemporary art. And the emergence of the other to mainstream Western culture. So those issues were playing out. I was still trying to just create the visual syntax for these issues, sort of aware of the issues, and I felt that they're sort of the fundamental visual quality that needed to be there was something technological, had to feel technological, and at the same time had to have the affect of the body. And then these more specific issues, whether it's gender, race, or whatever, could be played out, but had to be within this technological syntax, partly because I think the technological will change the discourse of whatever we want to talk about. Mm-hmm. And that, to that extent, I was aware of it. As the work evolved, once I felt the syntax was there, I then actually in the work became much more explicit about these issues, particularly in my case, being an Asian American in American society. I have now in more recent work addressed those issues specifically in the work, but the underlying context is there and was developed and took much longer to bring to fruition.
Yeah, maybe it's the specificity of this imagery is a good point to also look at the works that we see here in the space, because we see like orifices, we see nipples, we see parts of the body, scan images or X-ray images of a skeleton, we see surveillance camera images. So bodies are really present all over in these works related with these high-tech imageries, and also materials like the LED display. What is interesting, you insisted on at least from what I understood from the interviews, from your early interviews, you insisted on the embodied quality of technology from very early on. And if I read it correctly, I feel that in the first works you did, the body was not there as representation, but it was corporality, the materiality of the works that really distinguished them from coming as pure technological imagery. And then at some point you moved to include your fingerprint, then came these X-ray images. But here we also have those 3D body parts. I mean, in the centerpiece that we see here, we have those legs coming out. I'm wondering, when did it become important for you to lend the body a physical, like three-dimensional presence in your work? Is that something that you can trace back, or what was it related to? How did you come to move?
I think I
way?
always was trying to do that. The question is I didn't have the technique or the know-how of how to do it. So because I didn't have a classical training, let's say in figurative work, I couldn't do a figure in clay, to sort of Western tradition, like you see if you go to the Albertina Museum or whatever. I didn't have that tradition in American art teaching. So in the paintings at a certain point, with the idea that if I'm going to be talking about technology, I should be working technologically, I moved to silkscreen. And so that was printed. I could still photograph the forms that I made by hand. It would have that quality, but then it would be somewhat more technological, more manufactured. And once I jumped to silkscreen, then I could bring in actual photographic images. And that allowed me to use images often from medical textbooks and to really clarify that what I'm trying to talk about is the body. Before that, people were saying, are these musical instruments? Are these moonscapes? Are these landscapes? So I was saying, okay, I really have to clarify what I'm trying to deal with and just narrow it down to one thing is the body and then something very technological. So once I used the actual body, the photographs from body, partly by the fact that we even have photography, that we have now seen the body in ways that people never could see it before, particularly with digital imaging, then that task in a way was sort of resolved. And then the development of 3D scanning and 3D printing allowed me to then take that photographic quality, which for me is the clinical. I was very interested in the clinical sense of the body because the clinical, in the medical environment is kind of the most technological way we perceive our bodies today, which is different than the painted body. And I wanted that sense of factness, that it is so real. And so with the 3D scanning, which is only, I've only started using it in the last 5-6 years, then, you can get the pores of the skin really in the cast. And through that, I'm now, through the 3D printing, and then using that for the mold, now I'm able to bring these, three-dimensional forms. But that's only very recently. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an example of how partly the work unfolded or evolved because of the development of technology itself, or visual imaging, basically, has allowed the initial vision, which was actually somewhat frustrating because I couldn't do it, to really unfold in a way where the work now is technological, it's produced technologically, but the underlying conceptual and syntactical, the syntax of it was laid out before the technology arrived. Mm-hmm. And that's happened even more recently. In these works here, a few of them, I'm using AI for the first time, which is kind of a totally unexpected evolution. And it's really that the context of the work is like a perfect kind of segue for me to be able to introduce AI in the way the images are being produced now. And at the same time, it is expanding the initial sense of this integration of the body and technology. Yeah, and asking even more radical questions about this interface of the body and the technology. I think the initial re-examination of the work is looking at the screen, the iPhone, that kind of thing. I don't think ultimately that's really what the work is going to be about. I think it's going to be about something perhaps more ontological.
Yeah. Maybe we stick a little moment with the materiality of your work, because even if we now see an LED screen or this is like a print, you're someone who's really obsessed with materials, I would say. I mean, you describe how technology and the production technologies have affected the range of your work, but you've always been interested in materials and the fabrication of your work. What were important steps in those, in the changes in your works? I remember that you said at some point, I was working with synthetic matter, so I needed synthetic material to convey this content.
Well, I think the move to silk screen, the introduction of photography, the introduction of Photoshop and digital imaging was pivotal. I was trying to work with parts of the body in a way, and then when Photoshop came in, the tools are cloning literally, and I couldn't believe the sort of congruence of it. And then you could photograph skin, and I could mold with the skin in Photoshop and make forms. I used a Lego board and made this form, and then transformed the whole thing as though it were skin growing like a Lego board. So that was really amazing. Then the introduction of silicone was unique. That silicone can go from three-dimensional casting into paint-like material, and that allowed me to go from three-dimensional to two-dimensional into the language of painting seamlessly. And that seamless quality, for me, was fundamental to the quality of the digital. And then more recently, I think the 3D scanning and 3D printing, and then the AI, which is very, very new, I think is going to be very pivotal now. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you would agree, but when looking at the width of your work, in the beginning you started with claiming the objectness of the works that you were doing, the wall works, which were decidedly not painting, but objects, or to be looked at as objects. And my sense is, and maybe these two works particularly speak to that observation, is that I feel your work has transited from an object-based logic to an image-based logic more and more. So there's really an ontological shift going on within your practice, I would say. And I'm wondering, this is the first time I see an LED screen of yours. I mean, you had works where you had QR codes embedded, and then one would be led to a video that would be playing. So I came in, and of course I thought I would be watching a video, but I'm not. I'm watching a digital image here. And we're basically seeing surface behind surface, but we never get anywhere deeper. And I'm wondering if nonetheless there is this filmic thinking, which is also where you kind of started. You did take film classes when you were in Harvard, or how you would look at the transition of your work in the last years.
In the context of the
LEDs and
LED
this question
and
of
animation?
Where you are between image logic and object logics.
Well, when I was a student, I did take filmmaking classes. I was considered being a filmmaker. I thought film would be the medium of the future. But film at that time, independent film, just was very laborious. And I was told, I might wait 4 or 5 years to see your work realized, partly because of the cost and the kind of equipment you needed was very expensive. And I wasn't that patient. I could not wait that long. So I felt resigned that whatever I was going to do, I'm going to do more traditionally with just studio, paint, my sculpture, whatever. But also part of that was I was not interested in necessarily being in the most state-of-the-art technology. I was interested in the affect of what this technology is doing to us. And that doesn't necessarily have to be in the medium itself. And in fact, you might be an advantage not to be in the medium that you're actually talking about. An example would be, for instance, and I use this as a kind of reference point, when you look at Cubism, the way it developed, he wasn't using trains for his work, or airplanes, or cars. He was using something so traditional as paint. But he was talking about what the effect of this was having in terms of just consciousness itself. So for me, that gave a relevance perhaps to this more traditional medium in a sense, to still be very, very contemporary. So with that, that's partly how. Now, so in my practice, I have jumped around in different medias, partly because each medium has its own boundary. You can only say certain things in certain ways with each media. And so I'm interested in exploring this thing that is somewhat unknown to me in different media because each one will say something different about it. And so this is something I've had in mind quite a long time. Ironically, I'm now actually doing film. And this is the first time I've ever had an LED wall, which I have to thank Secession for allowing and supporting. So for me, one remarkable thing about this, just the LED itself, is that we're looking at this image and I don't need to have even a dark room. So we don't have this kind of process of going into a dark room. It's like going into a screen. It's just totally within the world we're in right now. And that for me is really important. At the same time, the nature of the work, it's animation. I work with an animator, Dante Caponi, in New York. And he and I were just developing from the syntax of the grass growing through this mesh. And I'm just exploring what I can do in animation with this iconography in a way. And so I have done videos throughout my practice. I just drew some or extracted some videos I already had because I don't have the time really to really start the whole project from scratch. I'm just experimenting with, now what can I do with this now with the technology we have now? So Dante told me that he couldn't do this even 5 years ago because the technology, even for animation, has accelerated so far just in the last 5 years. So I said, that's very exciting to me because now I've tried this before, it didn't quite work, and say, okay, let's go into it now. So this was very loose and very experimental. It's kind of the first step. It's a very simple structure. It's kind of just a zooming in and zooming out. The content is somewhat new where I'm introducing now nature in a more explicit way, partly because one thing I've always had in mind, aside from body and technology, is that the body really is also linking me to nature, to the organic. It's not so much about the body or the human species, but it's the organic world versus the technological world. And so in the organic, I want to put that in this context to see that the organic, our bodies, the technology, it's all one seamless continuum. And I think the whole issue of the environment really highlights that we are our environment. We are the animals, we are everything, and we need to think of it more holistically.
I think it's also, I mean, environment is such an interesting word because of course, we're moving from ecology to media environment. So already in that term, you have this, this transition of those things that have become nature to us are the things that are our environment. And that is, of course, both what we would describe as organic and nature, but then also the technology and the media landscape. Yeah. One thing that I wanted to ask you about is, and as you were talking about the affect that you wanted to create, is the all-over presence of glitches in your new and recent work. And I did find it very interesting, again, because in an interview or in a text from the late 80s, you already quoted about glitches, or you're already speaking about glitches, where you say that you're speaking about television, and you're speaking about the phone, and saying that whenever there's a technological glitch in the central phone office, the impact on the reality of life is enormous. I'm quoting you here. At that point, the system doesn't seem abstract anymore. And if I understand it correctly, at that time you're referring to the fact that whenever a glitch is produced, like a wrong telephone connection or anything, we would get to understand that behind this invisible system there's a structure, there's a physical reality, there's something that produces this reality that seems so immaterial. But now you're going to these glitches that we are all used with and all familiar with, and I'm wondering if you could position your interest in glitches again in relation to, is it still system, or are you looking at the affect side of imagery that is bent and warped and distorts our reality?
What do you mean by system? Do you mean is a glitch part of some system idea that I'm trying to convey?
That the glitch, the way you were describing it at the time, related to a hardware, to an infrastructure. While this is really glitches, I mean, they're produced in a software structure, they're produced on a visual level.
Well, the glitch is really just the vulnerability of technology itself. So it's like paint. So when I'm doing my work, there are all sorts of mistakes, all sorts of things that don't go right, that were not what I wanted to do, that, it's always not quite. But I realized I sort of almost asked for that. So one of the reasons I was interested in silicone after I did these digital works that were printed and finished is it was too controlled. I missed the accident, the contingency, the inability to control as you would have in painting. So I reintroduced, in a way, a medium like that with silicone. And that sort of, what's the word, hybrid sensibility that you have both very controlled and very much an accident was very important to me. So when I'm doing the work, when things are working, I say just leave it, that it is what it is, and just let it go. So for me, the glitch is just part of the process, and that's part of the vulnerability of life, and I think that's important. So I'm not interested sort of in the absolutely perfect, although we do try to get it, really, we're very obsessive, and the people I work with were very obsessive. But often when I said, look, if it doesn't work, don't worry about it. If it just goes like this, don't worry about it. So I said, try to go for it, perfect, and if it doesn't, we'll leave it, I'll take it. And so I kind of like that process where it's both and many times what I consider not perfect is really much better. It's much more interesting. I know, like with my fabricators, particularly in silicone, all of this is the first time he had ever done it. He works with acrylic casting, more like furniture or large, very formal, simple shapes. He said, well, I'll try it, and then it doesn't work. And I said, no, it looks fine, it looks great, so just leave it. So that aspect, and so here, there are lots of mistakes or glitches, not only in the digital, the way I put it together, but also even in the actual installation here, and getting all of these panels to come together. I see wrinkles, and I remember Bettina came and said, I'm sorry we have all these wrinkles. I said, Bettina, don't worry about it, it's fine. As long as when you're standing back there, you get a sense, that's what's important. You look at a work for me, 3 minutes, and you get a sense, and that's all. You're not examining it as though it has to everything right. So to me, that's very important. And also it's important to keep the work going and the people going. I don't want to drive them crazy with my perfectionism. So that's, the process, really, yeah.
Yeah. And still, I think there's so much to discover in perfection, in creating this idea of imperfection. That's so interesting about the work when you look at those overlaps where these grids just don't match and it looks like an ill-pasted poster, and so you're constantly also playing with evoking errors where there are none, which I think is also an interesting thing. Maybe one closing question. You've spoken about your exploration of AI. Do you want to tell us a little bit how it figures in the works and what you're currently researching or working on?
Well, the availability of AI for imaging is just very, very new. And I say all the artists and digital artists I've talked to are very just surprised that Photoshop and Adobe were able to introduce it so quickly after ChatGPT emerged. And I immediately started trying it. A collector said, Tishan, you've got to try this. He put it in front of me and says, type it in. You know, she just wants to push this onto me. And so I have now begun to use it, and it is really fascinating. I do think it's revolutionary in many ways. I'm also aware it's very dangerous in the bigger picture of what AI is doing. I don't think it's going to go away. Just within digital imaging, you know, many artists think this is going to take over the imagination. Artists are going to be wiped away. And having worked with it now, just in the last year or so, I don't think that at all. It's really, I feel comfortable with it. It's expanding my imagination. It's just another tool, but it's extremely powerful. And it is taking the work way beyond my imagination. And it's being created by the technology. But we created the technology. So I don't feel that it's so alien to me in that sense. I do feel that there's an input I have to make in using the AI that's critical. That the AI produces, for those of you who aren't familiar, you put in a word, let's say I'll say a pig's stomach on the skin or whatever, and then it'll give you 3 options. And usually it just throws a pig on the image I have, and I can't use it. So about 95% of what it produces for me is just not usable. And maybe just the 5% is amazing. And then I try to reproduce that. To do it again, I can't do it again. So I'm just beginning to get to know it a little bit. Now I've heard now that Adobe has introduced, I think it's called Spy or something like that, Spike or something, that now you don't need to have images to work with. You can just start totally from words, and it will imagine what the image is going to be, which is kind of where I was coming from. So it won't just throw a pig onto it. So that's kind of where I am in terms of the use of AI, just for imaging. There are much more metaphysical, political, everything questions coming out of AI, and that's a huge discussion that I don't really want to think we have the time right now to go into.
I would totally agree, but thank you, Tishan, because what I really appreciate about the way you work is that you're looking at these new technologies, you're not running away from them, you're using them, but at the same time you're not falling prey to this naive optimism of them doing everything better. I mean, of course, today it's much more difficult to fall for that optimism than it was in the 60s or 70s. So for my part, I can only say I'm very excited to see what comes next, and thanks a lot for this wonderful exhibition.
Thank you.